On debate, Senator Harder.
Thank you, Speaker. I wish to acknowledge as I rise today that I rise on the traditional and unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. Honourable Senators, I am pleased to share with you my support for Bill C-18, the Online News Act. Before we get into the details of the bill, I hope we can all agree that action is needed to address the challenges faced by the Canadian news sector at this time. A healthy democracy depends on well-informed citizens, and well-informed citizens depend on a free and independent press. Yet, with each passing year, we witness news outlets struggling to deliver on their mandates of providing Canadians with fair and unbiased information. As we all know, colleagues, a free and independent press is one of the foundations of a safe, prosperous, and democratic society. Ensuring the viability of news outlets is thus necessary and timely. We can also agree that our news consumption habits have changed forever. Long gone are the days of the broadsheet setting the agenda for public debate. Today, whether through our personal searches on the web or social media, the news reaches us via a number of digital platforms. But simply, the business model of these digital platforms is to capture billions of dollars in advertising in exchange for our eyeballs. But while the news business is doing the heavy lifting and covering news and the events of the day and reporting on issues that matters to our communities, be it local, national, or international, the very little value of that work goes back to them. If we agree that news has a crucial value in producing an informed electorate, then we must address the present imbalance that threatens our democracy. This legislation follows on the heels of a similar effort in Australia, but other countries are implementing or planning comparable laws. New Zealand, for example, announced in December of 2022 that its own legislation would draw heavily on what they call Canada's, quote, objective, future-proof, and transparent approach. The aim of Bill C-8 is to create a news ecosystem that promotes the creation of high-quality news content and reflects Canada's diverse voices and stories. We know that this type of content is central to our social and civic discourse and to the health of communities that make up this country. Without a healthy media, not just here in Ottawa, but in all communities, large and small, the public's capacity to hold their leaders accountable will atrophy. Voters become less informed or misinformed on what's at stake in elections. And policy prescriptions aimed at creating a better society are barely illuminated if they are discussed at all. We have seen that the spread of mis- and disinformation around the world can damage societies. A robust, questioning media is one of the most effective antidotes to these disorders. We all understand that freedom of expression and freedom of the press require that news reporting be done with full editorial independence, free from undue government interference. And it requires that Canadians be able to continue to express themselves online, including by sharing news content. Further, we must also acknowledge that ultimately our freedom of expression as Canadians depends crucially on the quality of the news content and information that we create and consume. Bill C-18 focuses its support on the entities that create high-quality news content, eligible news businesses, the outlets they operate, and the journalists they engaged. To be sure, services that aggregate the reporting of others for their users have a role to play in the Canadian information ecosystem. These online services represent great advancements in how we access news and, more widely, how we share information. But ultimately, these services, which act as gatekeepers to online information, are only as good as the information they curate. The success of some platforms as gatekeepers of information has allowed them to leverage a position of dominance in online advertising. This dominance creates an imbalance that undermines news businesses' revenue streams and the continued creation of quality news. That is why Bill C-18 aims to level the playing field between dominant online platforms and the news businesses. C-18 will support new businesses and their outlets when they primarily produce the kind of rigorous journalism and reporting that Canadians expect of professional news. The government estimates that annually approximately $215 million Canadian in compensation will go to from digital platforms to eligible news businesses in Canada. The Online News Act provides a legislative and regulatory framework that is flexible, modern, and encourages market fairness. It will set the table for platforms to sit down with media outlets of all sizes, equipped with the ability to bargain collectively, bringing players to the bargaining process on a more equal footing. This is the path forward for a better balance of bargaining power in the Canadian digital news ecosystem. The anticipated impact of C-18 is significant, regardless of whose financial estimates one uses. The Parliamentary Budget Office, for example, estimated the bill could result in $329 million in total compensation for new businesses. When you look at the definition used for broadcasters compared to the rest of the news industry, you will see it is far broader, so the breakdown on the broadcast side is likely higher. These potential discrepancies are worthy of committee discussion. But it can't be denied that these payments will provide a lifeline for our country's struggling news businesses. Key amendments introduced in the other place have improved the bill in several ways. Changes to the criteria for news business eligibility, the rules exempting platforms from the regime, and other elements that reflect calls from stakeholders to improve Bill C-18's ability to support a wider range of news businesses, including smaller news outlets and diverse perspectives. Who will benefit from this bill? First off, news businesses must apply to be eligible for participation in the bargaining. The Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, will designate news businesses as eligible if they meet a set of criteria intended to support rigorous, quality journalism that informs Canadians on important points. There are 4 ways for news businesses to be eligible: as a qualified Canadian journalism organization under the Income Tax Act, as licensed campus, community, or Indigenous broadcasters, as a Canadian organization covering news of general interest, or as an Indigenous news outlet. These carefully considered criteria are designed to ensure that only rigorous journalism benefits from this new regime. The first path to eligibility, the Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization, or here's a new acronym for you, QCJO, designation, you will recall, was developed in support of the Canadian Journalism Labour Tax Credit introduced in the 2018 Fall Economic Statement. It specifies that to qualify, news businesses must produce original reporting on issues and events that matter to Canadian readers, including news, features, investigations, profiles, interviews, and analyses or commentaries. These qualified news organizations are reviewed by a diverse and independent advisory panel of active or retired faculty of post-secondary journalism schools across the country. By leveraging the QCJO standard, we can keep the eligibility criteria for new businesses in harmony with existing legislation, proven experience, and keep the amount of red tape, government intervention, or duplication to a minimum. These QCJOs must also adhere to key journalist principles, including a commitment to research and verifying information before publication and presenting diverse perspectives and analyses. An eligible news outlet will also have a policy for correcting errors and honestly representing sources. The Other Place added a second route to being classified as an eligible news organization or business. Parties agreed that campus, community, and Indigenous broadcasters licensed under the Broadcasting Act do provide a great amount of local news and information across the country, even though they may not meet the QCJO definition. These broadcasters were added in recognition of their unique role and contribution to the Canadian news landscape. News businesses that are not designated as QCJO can also apply to be eligible if they report on current events of general interest, including coverage of democratic institutions and processes, and demonstrate rigor through editorial oversight and adherence to recognized professional journalistic standards. This route requires that an organization regularly employs 2 or more journalists. This 2-journalist threshold promotes consistency by reflecting the existing rules for qualification in the criteria for QCJO. It also favors a higher standard of reporting by ensuring that news content in question benefits from the editorial perspective and independent insights of another journalist, professional journalist. The 2-journalist requirement is a crucial factor for ensuring that Canadians have access to independent and rigorous journalism. An important other amendment was added in The Other Place, now specifies that this rule does not require journalists to operate at arm's length from the business. In other words, this allows for a framework that is more inclusive of startups and small news outlets, including those serving a diverse readership and more rural communities, whose owners or operators may also be practicing journalists themselves. Outlets in small prairie communities, Canada's North, and other isolated towns and villages, as well as ethnic media, will benefit from this bill. In many cases, these communities have but one local outlet upon which they can count. A fourth and final path to eligibility was added by The Other Place. The last route by which a news business can be considered eligible is an Indigenous outlet. Indigenous organizations operating in Canada are eligible if they cover matters of general interest and the rights of Indigenous peoples, such as treaty rights and the right of self-government. Bill C-18 is platform agnostic and will provide support to all types of news organizations. Print, digital, broadcast are all eligible under C-18 if they meet the criteria. Promoting the sustainability of Indigenous media in our country not only benefits the diversity of our media landscape, in supporting news media content that adequately reflects our nation's Indigenous cultural diversity, this aspect of C-18 are also reflective of our and the government's commitment to advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. There have been some questions as to why our national broadcaster should be eligible under C-18, since the CBC Radio-Canada already receives public funding. In many parts of our country, CBC Radio-Canada is the only source of reliable, fact-based journalism. Canadians rely on the information of our public broadcaster, and it is only to the advantage of the tech giants that our public broadcaster be excluded from being able to bargain over the value of their online content. Furthermore, why should Canadian taxpayers contribute to the bottom lines of these platforms by letting the content they help pay for be used for free? Taken together, these eligibility criteria for news businesses offer clear guidance for outlets wanting to benefit from the regime in being inclusive of a diversity of businesses, including small and independent business, the criteria support the bill's purpose of contributing to the sustainability of the news marketplace. As I have mentioned, C-18 will encourage digital platforms that have a dominant market positions to enter into voluntary commercial agreements that fairly compensate Canadian news businesses for the use and sharing of their news online. The CRTC will play an important role in ensuring that the legislation results in fair agreements that contribute to the sustainability of the news sector. An independent regulator, part of its job is to uphold freedom of expression and journalistic independence. The CRTC are experts in media regulation, fair and transparent public processes, and final offer arbitration. The Commission is well positioned to implement the regulatory tools included in this bill that prevent digital platforms from unduly favoring or disadvantaging certain news businesses, thus preserving the independence of the press. The Commission's role will be to help pave the way to fairly negotiated agreements, including developing a code of conduct and monitoring the marketplace to ensure that the framework continues to meet its objectives. And in the rare case that parties cannot agree, it will facilitate final offer arbitration, an option that Bill C-18 represents properly, in my view, as a last resort. One of the CTRC's role will be to grant exemptions from parts of the Act to platforms. To do so, platforms will need to demonstrate that they are contributing to a sustainable news sector by entering into fair commercial agreements with news businesses that reflects the diversity of Canadian news marketplace. Platforms, defined as digital news intermediaries in the Act, platforms wishing to be granted an exemption have a clear roadmap. It means making deals with outlets based in small communities from coast to coast to coast. It means making such agreements with news outlets producing coverage in both official languages, with Indigenous media, and outlets representing Black and racialized groups. It means there should be agreements with a balanced number of outlets from each region of the country. Agreements will have to guarantee that journalists and editors can still cover the issues and the stories that matter without interference, respecting the independence of the press and freedom of expression. New criteria introduced in the other place ensure that platforms must also enter into agreements with smaller players, such as not-for-profit outlets, new businesses serving diverse populations, and Indigenous news outlets. This is another reason we can be optimistic that this bill, once implemented, will have a positive impact in our news ecosystem. The rules for exemption from the regime provide platforms with a clear and transparent criteria to guide them in making a balanced and fair approach to making deals. The focus is on the scope of the agreements and the range of the marketplace they cover. The CRTC will grant an online platform exemption from the Act, provided the agreement it makes reflects this balanced and fair approach. These exemption criteria are objective and designed to advance the goals of the bill. To be clear, the CRTC will not pick winners or make losers. The framework is fundamentally based on free negotiations between news publishers and platforms, setting a level playing field for those agreements. It provides safeguards to ensure that ultimately agreements further the public interest objectives of the legislation. Transparency is built into the regulatory process at the very early step. This includes both the decisions on eligibility and exemption. The regulator will be able to assess whether any agreement between news businesses and platforms pose a risk to journalistic independence, safeguarding the freedom of the press. The information from this process will also feed into another key innovation in Bill C-18, the annual report by an independent auditor on the impact of C-18 on the digital news marketplace. Given the CRT's ability to assess agreements makes it easier to follow the outcomes and impact of the Act. This is how we can assess how well it is meeting its goals of enhancing fairness in the digital news marketplace. The CRTC's public processes provide the opportunity for commentary and course correction down the line if needed. Public processes make it possible to better gauge the impact of the legislation on the long-term viability of the Canadian news sector. It is one of the reasons Canada's innovative and flexible approach is seen by our like-minded countries as a model of objectivity and transparency.
Colleagues, senators, I would be remiss if I did not recognize the essential role of the media in protecting the vitality of our languages, culture, and identity. It is also important to ensure that Canadians have access to fact-based information in the official language of their choice. That is why C-18 requires platforms to enter into a series of agreements with the media, including local and regional news organizations in each province and territory, English and French-speaking communities, and official language minority communities. I'm also pleased that organizations like Hebdo Québec are expressing strong support for this legislation. I would like to share with you an excerpt from a statement issued by Hebdo Québec that I imagine reflects the sentiment of many media outlets across the country, and I quote, "It's not a question of technology, but rather a difference in bargaining power. Individually, newspapers cannot turn away from the platforms, or they will lose a large part of their readership and advertising revenue. Google and Facebook are the only option for many publishers, while the platforms can ignore any publisher's demands." End quote. The government will be there for Canadians because Canadians expect action to protect their local journalism in a transparent way. Because we must protect the future of a free and independent press. Because we must ensure that Canadians have access to fact-based information. Because we must, together, protect the strength of our democracy.
Now I'd like to take this opportunity to address some of the concerns I've heard around this bill. Much of the commentary around C-18 has involved unfortunate misrepresentations about pay per click and ending free speech online in Canada. Unfortunately, this commentary seeks to frame this legislation as yet another threat to the internet as we know it here in Canada. I'm sure that many of you are hearing some of these issues around the bill. But of course, it isn't hard to connect the dots. When commentators claim that C-18 will, quote, break the internet, what they mean is that Bill C-18 will impact the profit margins of the dominant platforms. It will require that these platforms share advertising revenues fairly with the people who create and publish the news content which appears on the platform's services. Australia has similar legislation, and let me assure you that the internet is still working there. I'm sure it will also work in New Zealand, as that country puts forward its own regime in the coming weeks. And when some say Bill C-18 will result in links being blocked online, what they mean is that big platforms are not above playing hardball. We all watched as Meta, in response to online news legislation in Australia, pulled links to news as well as information on essential services, including weather reports. We now know from whistleblowers that Meta calculated the withdrawal to maximize chaos and damage. But Canadians will not be intimidated. Dominant digital platforms should have to bargain fairly and in good faith, and that is what this bill provides. To be clear, C-18 would target the most dominant platforms who act as key intermediaries in the ways that Canadians access news. It would have these platforms negotiate agreements to fairly share the benefits they derive from the full scope of ways they make news content available to users of their services. C-18 is not a pay-per-click scheme for news. Those commentators who suggest this idea are, to my understanding, misrepresenting the framework. They see it through a conventional approach to online licensing, essentially a copyright license. But C-18 sits alongside the Copyright Act in the content of digital platform exercising significant power imbalances. It imposes a bargaining framework to require fair and good faith negotiations. C-18 is not copyright legislation. Actually, it's more in the form of ensuring fair competition in this area. Another myth, there are observers who say the bill C-18 is a link tax or mandates payments for links and conclude that the bill will incentivize clickbait over high-quality journalism and worse, and that it'll end free linking on the internet. But that is not what C-18 does. Nowhere does the bill mandate any kind of tariff or payment for a link. What it does require is that when links to news are made available by platforms that have significant power over news businesses, those platforms have to come to the table and bargain. That's all. This is a framework designed to empower news businesses in the digital economy. It is designed to help those businesses better leverage their news content and more fully realize the benefits of their efforts. It is designed to check the power of some of the world's most dominant platforms so that fair negotiations can take place. It does not introduce a tax, but rather it adjusts the marketplace to one that appropriately recognizes the value of news content and those who create and produce it. Recognizing the appropriate value of news content to the most dominant platforms means counting all the ways this content features on their services. One of the ways platforms benefit is by using this news content and the ability to access and share it to attract Canadians to their services. Links play a central role in this offering from platforms to Canadians. We saw that links to news content have a value to platforms when Google continued to refuse to pay publishers in the European Union under a copyright approach that includes headlines and snippets, but does not include hyperlinks. The results from the EU experiment have been found wanting, to say the least. Lengthy court battles over unyielding digital rights management systems have not delivered timely help to the news business. And that is precisely why C-18 creates a marketplace that considers all the ways news content is made available. Another important point I'd like to make is the following. Freedom of speech is not threatened by this bill. C-18 does not contain provisions that will allow anyone to block news links. C-18 does not contain provisions empowering anyone to prohibit the quoting of news. Instead, Bill C-18 imposes obligations on the most powerful entities in the online information ecosystem. It includes an obligation on platforms to not unfairly exploit the positions they hold as gateways to information online by redirecting crucial advertising revenue from the same news publishers whose work they feature on their services. Online platforms have long touted their services as the digital public square, as online spaces where citizens can connect to share ideas and make decisions about their lives, their communities, and their place in our broader society. And these platforms have enriched themselves immensely, becoming some of the most valuable enterprises in the history of the world by using network effects to essentially hold an audience captive. But the quality of the discourse in the public square can only be as good as the quality of the content through which people become informed and reach their understanding. And even as these platforms enrich themselves, new businesses, the ones that create the content on which Canadians rely for their information, are going out of business at an alarming rate. While it is true that a number of other independent outlets is growing thanks to the increased development of products for the web, it is also true that Canada has lost over 460 outlets since 2008. What is more, those losses have come in communities that are isolated and often served by only one outlet to begin with. Last month, Post Media, which operates more than 100 large and small newspapers across the nation, announced cuts of 11% to staff, which is already overstretched. Recently still, British Columbia-based Overstory Media Group announced layoffs affecting publications like Georgia Straight, Vancouver Tech Journal, The Coast, Burnaby Beacon, Fraser Valley Current, New West Anchor, Calgary Citizen, Tasting Victoria, Oak Bay Local, The West Shore, Victoria Tech Journal, Eat Tri-Cities, Calgary Tech Journal, and Capital Daily. It is hard for me to imagine that no one in this chamber has seen their home community untouched by layoffs or closures. As senators, our perspectives and ability to represent the concerns of our constituency are being weakened with this atrophying. If we don't already, we will soon lack the information required to make the best decisions for our fellow citizens' welfare. Finally, some have argued that only big media benefits from C-18. The evidence from Australia is the exact opposite. The whole point of the legislation is to get as many outlets as possible to the negotiating table. There is strength in numbers. By coming together, the smaller outlets will be in a stronger negotiating position, and they will finally get fair compensation for the content their journalists create. And it is that content that will drive advertising and subscriptions. What C-18 does is level the playing field so that news businesses may receive a fair share of the benefit when their works are made available on the dominant digital platforms. It ensures Canadian journalists can continue to create quality content to be discussed in the digital public square. By ensuring the continued creation of quality Canadian news content, C-18 fundamentally supports the sustainability of the news sector and in so doing, freedom of expression of all Canadians. Finally, I cannot overstate the importance of this bill for the future and sustainability of local news. It is critical that we support Canadian news media by fostering the best conditions for them to continue to produce journalism of the highest industry standards that reach our citizens no matter where they are. This issue is not to be taken lightly, given the number of Canadian jobs and businesses that are at stake. But it is also because the heart of the issue lies the vitality and sustainability of our very democracy. Citizens need to be able to make informed decisions about what they want to lead, what benefits and policies they believe will benefit them and their communities, and what services they can afford to pay for and those they can do without. This is particularly important in an age when citizens increasingly gravitate to simply the loudest voices. Just as government shouldn't pick winners and losers, nor should big tech monopolies have that right. Yet that is precisely what is happening leading up to the introduction of this bill. In an attempt to thwart it, the web giants have already negotiated content licensing agreements with some of the largest names in the Canadian news business: the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Le Devoir, to name just three. What C-18 does is allow many smaller outlets to come together as one to negotiate similar commercial agreements. Without legislation, those smaller outlets will wither on the vine, and the lucky few larger players to whom the platforms have offered short-term deals can kiss them goodbye when their term is up. Let me conclude by saying that while this bill is a priority for the government and has enjoyed multi-party support in the other place, this bill is urgent and essential for the news sector. Every month of delay risks further layoffs. It goes without saying that this bill requires appropriate and robust consideration in this place, but its passage ought to be expeditious because most of the outlets it would serve are in a perilous state. I therefore urge this chamber to advance this bill as quickly as possible to committee so we can continue just that review. Thank you.
Senator Lankin. Senator Ousakos had signaled that he wanted to ask questions. Senator Harder, you have 8 minutes. Will you take questions?
Certainly.
Senator Ousakos, followed by Senator Lankin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for your speech, Senator Harder. You know I was very skeptical about C-11 in terms of the government having an objective to predetermine winners and losers. In the case of Bill C-18, I understand the objective, and I think it's about fairness. It's about respecting copyright and content. But I still have some concerns, and I'm skeptical if it actually does achieve that. And what would we say now to critics that are going to argue that what the web does is actually just magnify and amplify the work of those content producers? So when a journalist at Québécois or CBC posts their platform on Twitter or on Facebook, they do it because they want to amplify and get as much reach as possible for their work. So without that platform, they wouldn't be getting that reach. So what happens now when we jump in an Uber and we go to dinner tonight? And once we get to the restaurant, the Uber driver says, I also want a percentage of the bill tonight that you spend at that restaurant in that institution, because if it wasn't for my platform, you wouldn't be having this exchange. Or this wonderful speech you just gave when you post it on Twitter or when the Senate puts it on Facebook, are we entitled to ask for royalties from all those platforms when we're actually using these platforms in order to propel our work?
Senator Harder.
Thank you for your question, Senator. If I could take your analogy, the Uber driver that will take us to dinner would be worthy of a portion of that expense if he were providing the dinner. He's not.
Senator Lankin, followed by Senator Simons.
Thank you. I won't go into Uber drivers. That's a matter for the new committee we're trying to establish. Senator Harder, I have two questions. The first, and I'm going into the weeds a little bit, I generally support the premise. As Senator Ousakos stated, it's about fairness, it's about copyright, it's about content, and it's about who does the heavy lifting in terms of the creation of that, gathering and creation. First, I want to know if you know how an organization like Canadian Press will be treated, given that it's kind of like a cooperatively owned organization, and the companies largely involved in that have their own agreements already negotiated. You just referred to that. Do you have a sense whether there is a duplication of payment there from the platforms, or whether they will not qualify as an eligible entity?
Senator Harder.
Thank you. My understanding, Senator, is that the agreements that are in place are with the publishing companies that from time to time are also including Canadian Press in their publications, and that is how the existing arrangements provide for compensation in that indirect fashion. Well, I can also state that you're correct in, as I stated, that there are some large newspapers that have agreements. I suspect the sustainability of those agreements will depend on this legislation, that this legislation will ensure that there's a requirement to so negotiate it fairly, and that is why the Newspaper Association of Canada is so supportive of this bill.
Senator Simons, followed by Senator Carosa. We'll make a. There's many senators, one question each. If time allows, we'll do a second round. Senator Simons.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Senator Harder, will you take a question? The bill we have before us today is not the same bill that was originally presented before the Christmas break. And I think it's important that people understand that the change wasn't a mere technicality. It wasn't a question of a sentence or a sentence fragment or a semicolon. The bill that was first presented to us contained an amendment which required a company that accepted one of these agreements to have rules about the kind of speech that appeared in print and to deal with misinformation. That amendment was, in fact, defeated at committee on the House side by a vote of 10-1. And yet the text of that very significant and controversial amendment was placed into the bill that was voted on in the House of Commons. And I'm wondering if you can enlighten us, maybe this is more a question for Senator Gold, but how was it that such an extraordinary and important error was made in the bill? And can you tell us, does this mean that the bill that was voted on in the House, if that bill had such a large error in it, how do we unscramble that omelet? Does the House have to revote?
Senator Harder.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Senator, that was the matter that the Speaker spoke to last week. And the Speaker, he was quoting the Speaker in the other place, who described the process that had taken place. That was not a government error. It was an administrative error by the officers dealing with the parchment and the delivery of the bill as passed in the other chamber. So it really is a non sequitur to the discussion, and I didn't reference it because, frankly, the Speaker had dealt adequately with that situation. You did speak that this bill is not the bill as originally. There are, in fact, and most of my speech was taken with the amendments in the other place, which I think make this a better bill and certainly bring a broader set of stakeholders to both the negotiations and I would expect the benefits of this bill. But I don't think we need to belabor the mistakes that were made inadvertently, I'm sure, by the clerks tending to the disposition of the bill and transferring it to this chamber.
Senator Carosa.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My question is just to go back to the broad principles of the Act, and I say this in light of the role that you've described with regards to the CRTC. I would just say that having been a commissioner there, that I think it has the ability to have open and clear hearings when it develops a regulation. It has extensive experience in mitigating the power imbalance that exists between big and small players, and it scrupulously stays out of content, especially when it comes to news. So if we can go back to first principles, I wonder if you could just say a little more about why we need this bill. What if we don't have this law? And is it going to help the small players most? And I do that simply because we often get into the weeds before we really understand the big picture of why we're doing this.
Senator Harder.
Thank you very much, Senator, for your question. Let me reiterate that without this bill, we will continue to see an atrophying of news sources, layoffs in the news generation sector, and that will contribute to an atrophying of public discourse. I don't want to be alarmist, but we ought to be concerned with the quality of public dialogue in Canada, and we do know that an independent press is an essential ingredient of our liberty and our democratic life together. This bill is designed to ensure that there are market-based negotiating requirements between the creators of content, the publishers, and the platforms that use that content to achieve advertising revenue. And it's the collapse of advertising revenue that has created the layoffs and the negative effects in the newspaper business. Secondly,
Senator Arder?
5 more minutes.
Do we agree with 5 more minutes? Agree.
Secondly, as your question infers, this bill now covers many small newspapers and that are devoted to either small geographic areas or ethnic media or specialized media, and that maybe that were previous to this amendment not eligible, but we also want to ensure that there is journalistic integrity in those outlets. So that is why there is the criteria that there be codes of journalistic professionalism. But we've also, in the other place, extended it to the 2-person journalism requirement to include the owner journalist, because in small towns like my hometown, the owner is also a working journalist. So it ensures that the broader scope of this market-based solution are extended to small outlets who can cooperatively then negotiate agreements. It is absolutely important to underline that the CRTC is not making these decisions. It is the bargaining process. And at the end, should the bargaining process fail, yes, there is final offer arbitration. But final offer arbitration, as you know, is not one where the arbiter decides the nature of the conditions. It's the choice of 1 or 2 of the bargaining parts.
Senator Dasko, followed by Senator Dow. Senator Dasko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator, would you take a question? My question relates to the platforms which will be participating in this program. You describe them as platforms with dominant positions. Can you articulate what is going to be considered in terms of which of the platforms are going to be looked at and required to make these arrangements? There's been a lot of speculation about, for example, is TikTok going to be part of it? Or some people have been saying that Facebook is not going to be running news content anymore. So a lot of these ideas have been floating around there, and I wonder if you can clarify who is going to be subject to this. Thank you.
Senator Harder?
As I tried to express, the bill is agnostic in terms of identifying particular platforms. So the code for that is, at this time, you would expect this to be Google and Meta, as they are the content providers and are the ones that are prominent market share at the present time. If that situation should change, that would require another set of negotiations. But it doesn't mean that the government is choosing which are the platforms. It's what are the platforms that are using and appropriating the journalist content created by the publishing community.
Senator Down.
Thank you, Speaker. Senator Harder, I'm wondering if you have any estimate, and you may not have this handy, but if you could provide it. I'm thinking, for example, the media in Prince Edward Island. Just how much funding are we talking? How much additional assistance, particularly for the weekly newspapers, some of the farming and fishing papers, very important for the industries. And we see the deterioration in the daily papers, less and less local content. I'm wondering if you have just a rough ballpark figure.
Senator Harder.
Thanks, Senator, for the question. It's a good one, and it's one where I don't want to, in my response, suggest this is the objective. But what experience in Australia suggests, and what the experts are, and indeed the experience with respect to the existing agreements in Canada. All of these are confidential, of course. So I am not privy to, and indeed the CRTC would not be privy directly to the aggregation, or at least its report would be an implied collective number. But the working principle is about 30%, 30 to 35% of the news expenditure. So this is not a cross-subsidy to non-news efforts. So it's not insignificant, but that is a reflection of what the value deterioration has been in terms of source of revenue for the publications that you reference.